Imagine standing on a medieval battlefield, steel clashing, screams echoing, the stench of blood thick in the air. But in the middle of all this chaos, the church keeper of souls and morals issues a strange command: ban certain weapons. Not because they kill, but because how they kill is too savage for God. This isn't about mercy. It's about control, fear, and power. Why did the church outlaw specific tools of war while blessing others? And what were these weapons so brutal? Even heaven said no. In the medieval world, the church was more than a religious was a political force, a landowner, a war broker, and, at times, a battlefield strategist. By the 11th century, it owned nearly 1/3 of all land in Europe and exercised direct control over kings, emperors, and knights. Its reach extended not just to the soul, but to the sword. Christian doctrine officially condemned violence, but medieval reality was far more complex. Warfare was not only tolerated, was sanctified when deemed righteous. Theologians drew fine distinctions between justified and unjustified violence: killing in defense of Christendom, acceptable; killing without ecclesiastical sanction, damnable. The church positioned itself not as an opponent of war, but as its moral regulator. This duality gave rise to a paradox. While Christ's teachings warned against bloodshed, bishops blessed weapons, led troops, and imposed codes of conduct on the battlefield. By defining which wars were just and which weapons were inhumane, the church maintained spiritual authority while adapting to political necessity. The peace of God movement in the late 10th century marked one of the earliest attempts to limit violence, especially against clergy and peasants. The truce of God followed, restricting warfare to certain days of the week. These initiatives weren't rooted in pacifism, they were mechanisms to stabilize a chaotic, feudal world where private violence was rampant. The church sought to impose order where secular lords failed. By the time of the Crusades, this regulatory role escalated. Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095 didn't just call for war, it rebranded killing as a pathway to salvation. Fighting the infidel was framed as an act of penance. The contradiction was institutionalized. War was condemned when it challenged church interests, blessed when it served them. But even in wartime, not all killing was equal. Certain weapons were seen as excessively cruel, dishonorable, or spiritually offensive. The church viewed some tools of war as undermining the moral framework it claimed to uphold. The concern wasn't always with human suffering. It was often about symbolism, status, and control. A weapon that enabled a low-born peasant to kill an armored noble threatened more than flesh. It challenged the divine order the church helped enforce. So bans emerged, not against war itself, but against specific methods of conducting it. Weapons that were stealthy, disfiguring, unpredictable, or perceived as cowardly were often singled out. This selective morality allowed the church to maintain influence over military conduct while avoiding a blanket rejection of violence. The church's involvement in regulating warfare wasn't about ending brutality. It was about managing it, about drawing a line between killing with honor and killing with chaos. And in doing so, it turned the rules of war into an extension of theological power. By the early Middle Ages, Christian doctrine had become the moral compass of Europe. Christ had preached peace, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, these ideals coexisted with sanctioned slaughter. The same institution that preserved the Gospels also led armies, blessed battles, and judged how men should kill each other. The contradiction wasn't hidden. It was defended, refined, and institutionalized. Theologians like Augustine of Hippo laid the groundwork with the concept of Balaam Ustamda, just war. Under this doctrine, violence could be morally permissible if it met certain conditions: right authority, just cause, and right intention. But as time passed, these requirements were interpreted with increasing flexibility. By the time of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the framework had expanded, allowing the Church to justify wars of faith, conquest, and even political dominance. These weren't abstract arguments. In 1095, Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade, declaring that taking up the cross to liberate Jerusalem would cleanse the soul. Killing infidels was not only allowed, it was sanctified. Indulgences were granted, absolving warriors of sin before they ever lifted a sword. The Church had reframed violence as a path to spiritual redemption, but not all violence was equal. The Church began to draw lines between what was considered noble and what was shameful. Weapons that killed from a distance, that disfigured, or that required no personal risk were treated with suspicion. A sword used in hand-to-hand combat was seen as an instrument of courage, a poisoned dagger or a crossbow bolt cowardly, unmanly, ungodly. The Council of Clermont in 1139 convened under Pope Innocent II formally banned the use of crossbows against Christians. The decree was clear: we prohibit under anathema that the crossbow and the bow, deadly weapons, be used against Christians and Catholics. The reasoning wasn't rooted in humanitarian concern. Crossbows allowed common soldiers to pierce knightly armor from a distance. They bypassed centuries of social hierarchy embedded in warfare. The ban wasn't just about morality, about control. This selective morality extended to the battlefield rules themselves. Killing a man in single combat was acceptable. Burning him alive, using deception, or denying him a chance at confession before death oaths were grounds for condemnation. It wasn't the act of killing that was questioned. It was the style. As medieval warfare became more brutal and mechanized, the Church positioned itself as the moral referee. It drew boundaries not to prevent death, but to ensure that death occurred within its approved moral structure. The result was a system where murder, if done in the right way, could be not only tolerated but blessed. The flail was never designed for elegance. A wooden handle connected by chain to a metal head, often studded with iron spikes, gave it a violent rhythm unlike anything else on the battlefield. It moved erratically, swung with delayed momentum, and struck from unexpected angles. Traditional shields and armor were often useless against it. Knights trained to block sword strikes found themselves blindsided by the flail's whiplash force. And, unlike a sword or lance, the flail didn't require precision, only momentum and impact. It likely evolved from agricultural tools used for threshing grain, which may explain why it appeared sporadically across different regions of Europe. But as it took on a militarized form by the 13th and 14th centuries, the Church began to view it not merely as a weapon but as a symbol of disorder. The problem wasn't just its lethality. It was the lack of control. The Church, obsessed with imposing a divine structure on earthly violence, regarded battlefield conduct as something that needed rules and ordered killing, not ungovernable brutality. The flail disrupted that. It was unpredictable, difficult to train with, dangerous even to the one using it. The very chaos that made it effective also made it offensive to an institution trying to impose hierarchy and discipline on warfare. In canon law and clerical commentary, there are scattered references to inhonesta argama, dishonorable weapons. The flail fell into that category. not because it killed more than a sword, but because it blurred the line between military action and unregulated violence. This was a time when knights were bound by codsreal or idealized chivalry and restraint. Warfare was expected to follow rituals, challenges, formations, standards of conduct. The flail operated outside that framework. The church's hostility to the flail was also ideological. It was harder to associate the weapon with noble symbolism. A sword could be ceremonial. A spear could be carried into mass. A flail, by contrast, looked savage, even barbaric. Its strikes didn't slice with precision, they crushed, tore, and broke bones. And unlike the crossbow or siege engines, which the church sometimes banned for their impersonal efficiency, the flail was banned for its chaotic intimacy. There's no surviving papal decree that names the flail explicitly, but church-endorsed military codes and regional synods condemned its use, especially in feuds or civilian conflicts. It was branded as a tool of desperation, used by militias and irregular forces rather than trained warriors. In that sense, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a threat to the social order the church worked to preserve. The flail's decline wasn't only due to religious pressure. It was a hard weapon to master, and often dangerous in close formations. But the church's disdain helped push it further into the margins of medieval warfare. In the end, it became less a tool of war and more a symbol of what the church feared most: chaos without control. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council issued a decree that sent shockwaves across the European military establishment. Under Canon 29, the Church officially condemned the use of crossbows and bows against Christians, declaring them deadly and hateful to God. But the reasoning behind the ban had little to do with divine mercy, and everything to do with power. The crossbow wasn't new by the time of the ban. Versions of it had existed in ancient China and Greece, but its resurgence in 11th and 12th century Europe marked a turning point in military technology. It was simple to operate, required minimal training, and had a devastating impact. A peasant with a crossbow could penetrate a knight's mail armor at a range that made traditional hand-to-hand defense useless. The weapon flattened the battlefield. Hierarchy, and that was precisely the problem. In feudal Europe, war wasn't just about territory, it was about status. Knights weren't merely soldiers, they were elite warriors bred for combat, trained from youth in the arts of riding, swordplay, and strategy. Their armor and horses were symbols of class, wealth, and divine favor. The idea that a low-born infantryman could defeat a mounted noble with a single shot cut directly against the grain of the social order. The church's involvement was not incidental. It had long supported the knightly class as both spiritual and political allies. Bishops and abbots often came from noble families. The church relied on aristocratic warriors to defend its land and enforce its decrees. So when a weapon emerged that rendered those warriors vulnerable to commoners, the threat was not just military, it was institutional. The council's ban was an attempt to contain that threat, but the language of the decree was carefully limited. The use of crossbows was forbidden against Christians. There was no restriction on using them against non-Christians, Muslims in the Holy Land, pagans in the Baltic, or heretics labeled enemies of the church. In fact, during the Crusades, crossbows were not only used, they were praised. Richard the Lionheart employed elite crossbowmen in his campaigns, and siege warfare across the Mediterranean relied heavily on their firepower. What the church feared was not cruelty, was collapse. The collapse of knightly dominance, the collapse of feudal privilege. and the collapse of a system where violence was supposed to be exercised only by the ordained or the noble. The crossbow offered a different kind of battlefield, one where training, birth, and religious blessing mattered less than mechanical advantage. Despite the ban, crossbows did not disappear. They spread. By the 13th century, crossbow guilds formed in cities across Europe. Mercenary armies adopted them. Even the Papal States employed crossbowmen in their defenses. The prohibition remained on paper, but enforcement was selective and often ignored. The crossbow marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one where technology would begin to challenge theology. A weapon that could be handed to a farmer and turn him into a night killer was more than just a military tool. It was a symbol of how quickly the balance of power could shift. The church saw it coming and tried to stop it, but the weapon proved too useful, too efficient, and far too revolutionary to be silenced by decree. Greek fire was more than a weapon, it was a spectacle of fear. Developed in the 7th century by the Byzantine Empire, it redefined naval warfare and psychological dominance. Its exact composition remains unknown, lost to secrecy and time, but records confirm it was a liquid incendiary that could cling to ships, flesh, and armor, burning even on water. When fired through pressurized siphons or launched in ceramic grenades, it produced a wall of flame so violent that enemies described it as supernatural. Its earliest recorded use came during the Arab siege of Constantinople in 673 CE Byzantine. Ships equipped with Greek fire turned the tide of battle, setting enemy vessels ablaze mid-sea. Chroniclers compared it to lightning, to molten metal, and most tellingly to the fires of damnation. For those who witnessed it, Greek fire didn't seem like a human invention. It felt infernal. This perception wasn't confined to foreign enemies. Within the Byzantine Church, debates soon arose. Fire had long been a religious symbol. In Christian tradition, flames represented both purification and punishment. Hell itself was described as an unending furnace, and divine wrath often arrived in the form of fire. Sodom and Gomorrah, the burning bush, the tongues of Pentecost. Using fire as a weapon on earth, especially in warfare, carried dangerous implications. While the Byzantine state embraced Greek fire for strategic defense, Western Latin Church authorities viewed its use with discomfort. In Western Europe, where the papacy held more sway over military morality, fire-based weapons were increasingly associated with blasphemy. The theological unease stemmed from the belief that fire, as a tool of divine judgment, should not be wielded by mortal hands in the chaos of battle. By the 11th century, the Church's distrust of incendiary warfare became more pronounced. The use of burning oil, tar, and resincament adaptations of Greek fire was condemned in various regional synods. These substances, especially when thrown onto besieged cities or into crowds, were seen not only as cruel, but as inhuman, a word that carried spiritual weight in canon law. The concern wasn't only for the suffering inflicted, but for the perceived corruption of moral order. Fire didn't kill with precision. It consumed indiscriminately. Pope Innocent II's Second Lateran Council in 1139, which also banned crossbows, implicitly condemned the use of incendiaries among Christians. The argument followed a familiar line. Certain weapons exceeded the boundaries of acceptable warfare. They stripped victims of dignity, denied them last rites, and turned battle into massacre. Despite these objections, variations of Greek fire continued to appear in sieges across the medieval world, from the defense of Constantinople to the Crusader campaigns in the Levant. But the weapon's legacy was shaped as much by fear as by function. For the Church, fire remained a symbol of judgment, never to be taken lightly, never to be seen as just another tool of war. The line between divine wrath and human invention had been crossed, and not everyone was willing to follow, by the high Middle Ages. Blunt force weapons had become a mainstay on the battlefield. Maces, hammers, and clubs were widely used by knights, foot soldiers, and even clerics who were forbidden by canon law from shedding blood. A crushing blow, after all, didn't technically violate the Church's prohibition on drawing it. This legal and moral loophole allowed ecclesiastical warriors to participate in war while still adhering to religious doctrine. But then came a change, small, pointed, and brutal. The mace, once a smooth-headed weapon meant to dent armor and disorient opponents, began to evolve. Craftsmen added flanges, ridges, and eventually spikes. The morning star, essentially a mace with a spherical head bristling with iron points, emerged by the 13th century. It could tear flesh, shatter bone, and bypass even the best mail armor. It wasn't just a tool of war. It was a weapon designed to mutilate. That transformation had consequences. What was once seen as a morally acceptable compromise began to look like something else entirely. In the eyes of the Church, the addition of spikes blurred the boundary between permissible and excessive violence. The spike turned blunt force into something more intimate, more personal, and far more gruesome. And it raised uncomfortable questions about the Church's moral calculus. Was it truly the blood that mattered, or the suffering inflicted? Tensions rose when these weapons were used not just on the battlefield but in feuds, riots, and acts of political vengeance. There were recorded incidents in which clergy and noble officials were attacked with spiked maces, acts seen not just as violence but as sacrilege. In 1305, Bishop Guillaume de Nogaret's forces were reportedly armed with such weapons during the confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII. Though not the only factor, it reflected how these weapons had moved beyond military use and into internal conflicts that threatened Church authority. Clerical writings from the 14th and 15th centuries began to reflect growing discomfort. Synods in parts of Germany and northern Italy condemned the use of spiked maces and flail-like morning stars in civil disturbances. Some church councils called for their exclusion from tournaments and religiously sanctioned combat. The justification was not only theological but symbolic. These weapons represented excess force, applied not for justice or defense, but for humiliation. While never formally banned in the way crossbows were, spiked maces and morning stars hovered in a grey zone of medieval warfare. Their legality was uncertain, their morality was questioned, and their symbolism was clear. They embodied a shift toward brutality that the Church struggled to explain, especially when that brutality was turned inward in its own priests. On the nobility it claimed to protect, and on a system already stretched by social upheaval. In medieval warfare, there was an unspoken code. Death was acceptable if it came honorably. Sword to sword, face to face. But poison violated that code. It struck in silence, often days after the weapon was used. It was seen not just as cruel, but as deceptive, unnatural, and by the Church's standards, sinful. Unlike the mace or the bow, which had practical and symbolic justifications within Christian just war theory, poisoned weapons were viewed as fundamentally dishonest. They gave no chance for defense, no opportunity for confession, and no path to martyrdom. The victim might die in agony, unaware they had even been struck, and that, in the eyes of many Church authorities, was a spiritual offense as much as a physical one. Canon law did not take the issue lightly. By the 12th century, church councils began explicitly condemning the use of poison in warfare. The Third Lateran Council of 1179 didn't name poisoned weapons directly, but its canons included strong statements against treachery. And later commentaries from church jurists classified poison as perfidious and contrary to natural law. The church held that poisoning was not merely illegal, it was heretical in its method. Historical records show this wasn't just theory. In 1167, during the siege of Monte Cassino in Italy, reports emerged of defenders using arrows dipped in belladonna and monkshood. Although some accounts may have been exaggerated or politically motivated, the incident caused enough outrage to prompt condemnation from the local archbishop. In other cases, captured soldiers found to be carrying poisoned daggers were denied last rites an act of spiritual punishment, signaling that their crime had placed them beyond the mercy of the church. One of the most documented instances came during the 13th century, when German knight Werner von Bohlen was accused of using venom-coated knives during a regional feud in the Rhineland. A tribunal led by church officials not only excommunicated him, but declared that any future use of such weapons by his house would result in permanent ecclesiastical sanctions. His lands were temporarily seized, and he was forced to make public penance. The church's stance had a lasting effect. Manuals of chivalry and codes of arms written in the 14th and 15th centuries echoed the ban. Even as siege engines evolved and battlefield tactics became more ruthless, the use of poison remained taboo. Military guilds and knightly orders codified the prohibition into their charters. It was not merely a question of effectiveness, but of moral optics. Poison stripped warfare of what little honor it was thought to retain. Centuries later, these ideas found legal expression again. The 1899 Hague Convention and the 1925 Geneva Protocol would prohibit the use of chemical weapons in modern war. But long before international law caught up, the medieval church had already drawn a hard line. A blade may kill, but it must do so cleanly. Poison, no matter how effective, was a betrayal of both divine and human order. The garrote was never a weapon of war, it was a weapon of silence. A cord, wire, or length of cloth, used to strangle from behind. No metal, no clashing steel, no battle cry. Just a quiet, calculated end, usually delivered in narrow alleys, monastic corridors, or locked chambers. It belonged to assassins, not soldiers. Its simplicity made it dangerous. It required no training, no noble lineage, no costly forge, and unlike a sword or an axe, it left little blood-just bruises around the neck, and a body slumped where it had stood. In medieval Europe, where violence was often public, performative, and tied to notions of honor or chivalry, the garrote was something else entirely. It operated outside that framework. It left no room for valor, confession, or spiritual preparation. This was the Church's deepest concern. In Christian doctrine, the moment of death was sacred. Last rites, the sacramentum extrema, unctia, were essential for the salvation of the soul. A sudden, unannounced death denied the victim a chance to repent. From the Church's perspective, this wasn't just murder, it was a theft of eternity. Canon law didn't name the garrote directly, but ecclesiastical courts consistently condemned killings that took place in secret or without warning. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 emphasized the importance of confession before death, and theological commentaries from figures like Gratian and Thomas Aquinas made clear that stealth killing, particularly without the possibility of absolution, carried heavier spiritual consequences than death in combat. There were political dimensions too. Assassinations using garrots often targeted clerics, nobles, or bureaucrats. In 1294, a papal envoy was found, strangled into losing a weapon. No witnesses, no blood. The response from Rome was swift. Mass excommunication for those suspected, and a local bishop ordered to preach against the tools of Satan used in the shadows. It was less about the method, more about the symbolism. The garrote represented a form of violence that bypassed both earthly and divine law. As centralized justice systems expanded in the 14th and 15th centuries, the garrote itself was paradoxically adopted as an official method of execution in parts of Spain and Portugal used for traitors and heretics. But even in this institutional context, its reputation remained grim. Executions by garrote were seen as dishonorable, reserved for those deemed unworthy of a clean death by sword or fire. 2. The church, the garrote, wasn't just a tool of killing. It was a rejection of ritual, an erasure of moral order. It denied the victim their moment before God, and it did so in silence. For an institution built on confession, that silence was intolerable. Siege warfare in the Middle Ages was a brutal calculus of endurance, engineering, and fear. Castles and walled cities offered refuge, but also became traps. When a siege began, it wasn't just about storming walls, it was about starving defenders, breaking morale, and overwhelming them with scale and pressure. The church, though willing to bless wars it considered righteous, drew uneasy lines when it came to how that pressure was applied. Traditional siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams were tolerated. These were seen as tools of military necessity, but as tactics evolved, some methods crossed into territory the church could not ignore. By the 14th century, reports emerged of besieging armies using catapults not to hurl stones but to launch corpses, specifically diseased corpses, during the 1346 siege of the Crimean port city of Kaffa. Genoese defenders faced Mongol forces under the Golden Horde. According to accounts by the chronicler Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongols began launching the bodies of their own plague-infected soldiers into the city using trebuchets. The intention was not just psychological, it was biological. The dead spread fear, contamination, and likely the Black Death itself. Some historians debate whether this act directly contributed to the spread of the plague into Europe, but the event remains one of the earliest recorded uses of biological warfare. The Church's reaction was swift and unequivocal. Although the papacy had no direct authority over the Mongols, canonists and theologians condemned the practice as contra naturamo, against nature. Disease was seen as divine punishment, not a legitimate weapon. To weaponize pestilence was to imitate the wrath of God, and that, in the Church's view, was blasphemy. This wasn't an isolated issue. Other examples followed. In 1422, during the Hussite Wars, Czech forces reportedly used catapults to fling carcasses and excrement into besieged towns held by Catholic loyalists. The tactic drew sharp condemnation from church officials, while killing in battle was accepted. Even under the right circumstances, infecting entire civilian populations with sickness was treated as spiritual defilement. The difference was theological and symbolic. War was meant to test courage, discipline, and loyalty. Disease was invisible, creeping, and indiscriminate. It offered no chance for confession, no moment of redemption, and no clear line between combatant and bystander. For the Church, that made it not just cruel but unholy. Despite these moral objections, the tactics persisted. As siege warfare became more desperate and protracted, commanders sought every possible advantage, but the Church's denunciation, delivered through sermons, decrees, and excommunications, reinforced a broader doctrine. There were limits to cruelty, even in war. Fire and steel might take lives, but to spread rot and plague was to defy the divine order entirely. Church councils passed decrees, popes issued anathemas, clergy preached against the use of forbidden weapons, from crossbows to incendiaries to poisoned blades. But on the battlefield, these bans often collapsed under the weight of politics, power, and military necessity. The Second Lateran Council of 1139 famously banned the use of crossbows and bows against Christians. Yet, just decades later, Christian armies deployed crossbowmen in nearly every major conflict. The Third Crusade, launched in 1189, relied heavily on crossbow units, especially among the forces of Richard I of England. His siege of Acre in 1191 featured hundreds of crossbowmen targeting Muslim defenders from fortified positions. The papacy, fully aware, remained silent. When war was declared holy, the rules shifted. Exceptions weren't rare, they were systemic. The Church's moral authority was tied to its alliances. When crossbows threatened Christian knights in internal wars, they were condemned as instruments of cowardice. When they served the Church's campaigns abroad, they became tools of providence. The contradiction was rarely addressed directly. Instead, it was absorbed into a growing divide between theological doctrine and military practice. The same pattern played out with fire-based weapons. Despite clerical opposition to Greek fire and similar incendiaries, Christian forces used burning oil and tar in sieges from the Holy Land to Iberia. During the 1204 Fourth Crusade, Latin crusaders sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, homes, churches, and libraries. No official sanction followed. The Church, embarrassed by the optics, but unwilling to alienate its military patrons, deflected rather than punished. Even poison, so clearly condemned in ecclesiastical writings, found its way into political assassinations and siege tactics. In 1258, during a dispute in Lombardy, Milanese forces allegedly contaminated wells outside enemy strongholds. Accusations of spiritual crimes were made, but no excommunications were enforced. The offenders had powerful backers, and local bishops looked the other way. Church officials often justified these contradictions through legal nuance. The original bans were framed as applying only to Christians attacking other Christians. Weapons used against non-Christians, heretics, or excommunicated rebels were often exempt. The logic was clear. Once a man was outside the Church's grace, he no longer deserved its protection. This allowed commanders, bishops, and even popes to support violence that technically violated canon law without challenging their own moral authority over time. These inconsistencies became normalized. Military necessity took priority. Bans remained in theory, but in practice, they became suggestions, flexible tools used to criticize enemies, not restrain allies. What mattered was not whether a weapon was cruel or unfair, but whether its use aligned with the interests of the Church and its political allies. The Church spoke of order, mercy, and moral limits. But on the ground, in the mud of medieval battlefields and the chaos of crusades, those limits were tested and often ignored. In the end, doctrine bowed to ambition. Morality was enforced when convenient and broken when it wasn't. The medieval Church drew lines on the battlefield, bans on crossbows, poisons, incendiaries, and mutilating weapons, not to stop war, but to shape it. Behind every decree was a question of control. Who could kill, how they could kill, and who was allowed to die with dignity. These weren't humanitarian protections in the modern sense. They were mechanisms to preserve authority, hierarchy, and spiritual order. Centuries later, the language has changed, but the logic hasn't disappeared. The Geneva Conventions of the 20th century outlawed chemical weapons, banned attacks on civilians, and codified the rights of prisoners of war. The Hague Conventions restricted expanding bullets and required armies to avoid unnecessary suffering. But behind these laws, political calculations still lurk. Just like the Church once condemned the crossbow when it threatened knights, but allowed it against infidels, modern powers find ways to exempt themselves from the rules they promote. During World War I, chlorine and mustard gas spread across battlefields in Europe, despite international bans. In the Vietnam War, the United States deployed napalm and Agent Orange, technically not defined as chemical weapons under the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Russia, the US, and other nuclear states signed treaties against proliferation while maintaining their own arsenals. The pattern is familiar. Moral boundaries exist, but enforcement depends on who is in power. What connects medieval and modern warfare is the tension between ethics and utility. The Church's bans were cloaked in spiritual reasoning terms, like dishonorable, inhuman, ungodly, but the deeper concern was often political, maintaining the dominance of the knightly class, preventing weapons that democratized killing, protecting clergy and noble allies. In the same way, today's laws of war are shaped by states that hold the most to lose if warfare slips out of control. But there is a crucial difference. The medieval Church believed it was safeguarding souls, that war had to be governed not just by politics, but by divine law. Today, the framework is secular, rooted in human rights, humanitarian law, and international consensus. Yet the challenge remains: how to restrain violence without undermining the power structures that enforce those restraints. Medieval bans weren't about ending war. They were about regulating the spectacle of it. They revealed the contradictions of an institution that preached peace but wielded the sword. And they left behind a legacy, one that echoes in every modern debate over drones, cyber attacks, autonomous weapons, and civilian casualties. Were those early bans truly acts of mercy or acts of control? The answer lies not in the words of the decrees, but in the choices made when the rules were tested. Then, as now, it wasn't the weapon that defined the ethics of war. It was who held it and why.